It began like any other shift. The night staff at the VA Medical Center in Northport, New York, moved with practiced calm. The scent of sterile floor, wax mingled with hospital-grade coffee, brewing at the nurses' station. Distant murmurs echoed down the halls, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of rubber soles on polished tile. It was quiet. The kind of quiet you learn not to trust in a hospital. The kind that means something's coming. Nurse Rebecca Hayes checked her patient's vitals. All normal. Just like they'd been an hour earlier. The man, mid-60s, recovering from surgery, smiled weakly and thanked her. She squeezed his hand before turning away. 3 doors down, another nurse was restocking medication trays when she heard it. A crash, followed by a gurgled moan. She ran. The patient had seized. Foam at the mouth. Blue lips. No pulse. Code blue. The hallway exploded with movement. Doctors sprinting, carts rolling, paddles charging. But it was already too late. Within the hour, another patient, different wing, different floor, went into sudden respiratory failure. No warning. No known complication. Dead within minutes. Rebecca's hands trembled as she filled out the incident report. And then, barely louder than a whisper, one of the senior nurses leaned over and asked, "Did Dr. Swango check on them today?" No one laughed. It wasn't a joke. It was fear. Real, bone-deep fear. The kind that tightens your chest and makes your instincts scream before your mind can catch up. The kind that tells you something is horribly wrong, but you can't prove it yet. Because this wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 5th. And the nurses knew, wherever Dr. Michael Swango went, death followed. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like someone you'd trust with your life. Michael Swango was clean-cut, almost boyish. His sandy blonde hair always neatly combed, his glasses perched low on a narrow nose. He walked like someone who belonged, confident but not arrogant. Quiet, polite, focused. He was the kind of man who made people feel at ease. He remembered names. He asked patients how they were sleeping. He offered to cover extra shifts. He brought cookies to the break room. And he wore the white coat like armor, pressed, pristine, spotless. Colleagues called him dedicated. Supervisors called him sharp. He'd been top of his class, they said. Driven. Intelligent. But they didn't know. They didn't see the notebook in his locker filled with obituaries. The poison kits he stashed in his car. Their obsession with control he'd been nurturing since adolescence. They didn't see the way his eyes lingered just a little too long when a code was called, or how he always seemed to be nearby when things went catastrophically wrong. To most, he was just another resident, just another man in a white coat trying to make a name for himself. But to those who paid attention, those who tracked the deaths, the seizures, the sudden declines, Michael Swango wasn't a healer. He was a hunter, and the hospital, it was his hunting ground. Born in 1954 in Tacoma, Washington, Joseph Michael Swango was raised in Quincy, Illinois, a conservative, quiet town tucked along the Mississippi River. From the outside, his childhood looked unremarkable. But behind closed doors, his life was defined by instability. His father, a career Army officer, was a heavy drinker, stern, emotionally distant, and frequently absent. Swango's parents divorced when he was young, and that absence may have carved something hollow inside him. Even in high school, Swango stood out. Not because he was popular, not because he was athletic, but because of his obsession with death. While classmates posted Beatles lyrics on their lockers, Swango clipped newspaper articles of car crashes, mass shootings, medical anomalies. He collected them, categorized them. It wasn't curiosity, it was fixation. In college, he studied chemistry and biology with a rigid intensity. He wasn't just good at science, he needed to be good at it. Control, precision, power. They became a substitute for connection. No one knew then that his fascination with death would soon evolve into something monstrous. Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, 1982. It didn't take long for Swango to make an impression, and not a good one. He skipped clinicals, faked patient check-ins, lied on charts. When confronted, he deflected. Professors were concerned, but there wasn't enough to fail him outright. At least, not officially. And then patients began dying. At least 5 medical students raised alarms. Patients who were stable one day suddenly deteriorated after being treated by Swango. A healthy woman, recovering from a minor surgery, flatlined without explanation. Another, a man being prepped for discharge, died hours after Swango was left alone with him. Still, the university passed him. In 1983, he graduated with a medical degree. Swango had crossed the first checkpoint, and the system had let him through. Fresh from graduation, Dr. Michael Swango began his internship at Ohio State University Medical Center. This was a prestigious opportunity, but soon whispers began to circulate among the nurses. They noticed something strange. Patients who had been stable would suddenly suffer seizures, respiratory failure, or cardiac arrest. And nearly every time, Swango had been in the room. One nurse watched him inject something into a patient's bag, then walk out without saying a word. That patient died hours later. The staff started a log, dates, times, patient names, incidents. It wasn't paranoia. It was a pattern. But again, administrators hesitated. They didn't want scandal. They didn't want lawsuits. Instead of pressing charges, they launched a quiet investigation. And then, without fanfare, they fired Swango in 1985. No criminal charges. No medical board report. Just silence. The hospital buried the evidence. And Swango walked away. After being fired, Swango couldn't get work in hospitals. So he turned to the next best thing, emergency medical services. He became an EMT in Illinois. It should have been a fresh start. But once again, people around him started getting sick. His co-workers grew violently ill after shared meals. One medic passed out in the middle of a call. Another suffered seizures. A third hospitalized for days. Someone noticed Swango always brought food to share and never seemed to eat it himself. When investigators tested his belongings, they found arsenic and other toxic substances in his locker. Finally, some accountability. Swango was arrested in 1985 for aggravated battery and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 2 years, for poisoning colleagues. And when he got out in 1987, the real horror began. Most people after prison would struggle to find work. But Swango wasn't most people. He had charm, credentials, and lies. He changed his name, forged new recommendation letters, glossed over his criminal record. And it worked. By 1991, he was practicing medicine again. He'd conned his way into a residency at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. A clean slate, a new badge, and patience, lots of patience. And once again, those patients started dying. Veterans, stroke victims, elderly men recovering from surgery. One moment, stable. The next, gone. Nurses began tracking him again. They spoke to administrators. This time, the hospital took their accusations seriously. They opened an investigation. And Swango did what he always did when the walls started closing in. He vanished. In 1994, Michael Swango resurfaced halfway across the world, in Zimbabwe. He now called himself Dr. Daniel Adams. With forged documents, he secured a position at Neen Lutheran Mission Hospital, a small rural facility eager for Western-trained doctors. They didn't ask questions, and once again, patients, many of them children, began dying. Respiratory failure, cardiac arrest, mysterious convulsions. Most were fine just moments earlier. One nurse, suspicious, walked in on Swango holding a syringe over a child's foreline. When she asked what he was doing, he said it was vitamins. She wasn't convinced. Word spread. Rumors reached the hospital board. By the time they began investigating, Swango was gone. Again. He fled Zimbabwe and re-entered the U.S. By 1997, the FBI had started to connect the dots. Valerie Caproni, a federal prosecutor, was handed a case file thicker than a phone book. Deaths in Ohio. Poisonings in Illinois. Fatalities in New York. Suspicious activity in Africa. Everywhere Swango had worked, someone had died. Caproni partnered with the FBI and Interpol. They tracked his aliases, dug through hospital records, collected testimonies from survivors, colleagues, and grieving families. And what they found was staggering. Dozens of suspicious deaths, nearly all with one common denominator, Dr. Michael Swango. He was arrested in 1997 at Chicago O'Hare Airport while trying to flee the country, this time to Saudi Arabia. The charge: fraud, lying on employment applications. But prosecutors had much more in mind. In October 1997, Michael Swango was finally in federal custody. After nearly 2 decades of moving state to state, hospital to hospital, leaving unexplained death after death in his wake, he was caught. But it wasn't a murder charge that brought him down. It was paperwork. The U.S. government charged Swango with fraud, lying on federal employment forms when applying to the Veterans Affairs hospital system. It may have seemed minor, considering the scope of his crimes. But investigators weren't interested in a slap on the wrist. This charge bought them time to dig deeper, to build a case not just around fraud, but murder. Behind the scenes, the FBI was working around the clock. They scoured hospital records, interviewed nurses and staff, subpoenaed toxicology reports that had long been overlooked or dismissed. One by one, they began identifying cases where Swango's presence directly preceded a death. Patterns formed, motives solidified, and the horrifying truth became undeniable. Swango kept to himself in jail. He was cold, precise, but he wasn't silent. Letters he wrote to former friends and colleagues began surfacing. One, in particular, stunned investigators. In it, he confessed, not directly, but in that twisted, detached way he always spoke. He wrote about feeling the power of God in the moment before death. He described the euphoria of control. He even joked about dodging investigations, calling the administrators who failed to report him idiots in lab coats. This wasn't remorse. This was pride. The prosecution, led by Valerie Caproni, offered Swango a choice: plead guilty to specific murders, just a fraction of what he'd likely committed, or face the death penalty. Swango agreed. In July 2000, Michael Swango stood before a federal judge and calmly pled guilty to killing 3 patients, attempting to kill several others, and deliberately poisoning colleagues. The courtroom was silent. No emotion on his face. No apology. Just cold admission. In exchange, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge called him a chilling reminder of what happens when the system fails. Of the hundreds of people who encountered Dr. Swango, only a few names ever made it into official court documents. But behind each name was a life, a story, cut short. Thomas Samarco, a Vietnam veteran, was recovering well after surgery at the VA Medical Center when he suddenly collapsed. His wife, who had been sitting just down the hall, had no idea that within minutes he would be gone. Richard Taylor, another veteran, was joking with nurses when his oxygen levels plummeted without explanation. By the time help arrived, he was brain dead. Rosemary Tinning, 47, went to the hospital for a minor procedure. She walked in with her husband. She never walked out. All 3 were killed by Swango, and they were just the ones the court could prove beyond a shadow of doubt. Investigators now believe he may have poisoned up to 60 people, possibly more. The real number we'll likely never know. What makes the story of Michael Swango so devastating isn't just what he did, but how many chances there were to stop him. Time after time, hospitals saw the signs: sudden deaths, suspicious injections, co-workers falling ill. Time after time, they swept it under the rug. Ohio State, Stony Brook, the VA, Zimbabwe. Each one could have pulled the alarm. Each one chose silence over scandal. There were memos, complaints, whistleblowers. Nurses begged administrators to investigate. Some even risked their careers to speak out. And yet, Swango kept getting hired. Why? Because hospitals feared lawsuits. They feared bad press. They feared what they might uncover if they looked too hard. And because of that fear, people died. Among the people forever changed by Swango's crimes was Patricia Franklin, whose mother died under Swango's care at the Northport VA hospital. She was fine, laughing, talking, and then she was gone, Patricia said in a later interview. They told me it was a heart attack, but she didn't have heart problems. For years, Patricia didn't know the truth. It wasn't until she saw his face on the news in 2000 that it hit her. This was the man who'd been in her mother's hospital room just before she died. She wasn't the only one. Families came forward. Dozens of them. Many had long felt in their bones that something wasn't right. Now they had a name for it, and a face. But for many, justice came too late. Today, Michael Swango resides at ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison in the United States. It's where the government sends the worst of the worst: terrorists, mass murderers, cartel leaders. Swango spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. No windows. No internet. No visitors. Only a concrete cell, a steel bed, and the weight of what he's done. He is not eligible for parole. He never will be. He has filed no appeals, given no interviews. His silence now stands in contrast to the chaos he once left behind. But that silence is not peace. It's containment, and it came decades too late. Michael Swango's case didn't just rattle hospitals. It shook the very foundation of trust in modern medicine. A doctor is more than a practitioner of science. To the sick, they are hope. To families, they are guardians. Their authority is rarely questioned, their decisions often followed without hesitation. And Swango used that trust like a scalpel, clean, sharp, and lethal. His crimes forced the U.S. medical system to confront a terrifying question. What happens when a predator wears the robes of a healer? After Swango's arrest and conviction, a reckoning began. The National Practitioner Data Bank, originally created in 1986, was strengthened. It became mandatory for hospitals and licensing boards to report disciplinary actions, malpractice, payments, and restrictions placed on physicians. This central database, once seen as a bureaucratic formality, was now seen as a lifeline, one that could have stopped Swango had it been properly enforced. Credentialing procedures were overhauled. Hospitals began implementing rigorous background checks, not just for malpractice, but for criminal records, falsified documents, and interstate behavior. For the first time, hospitals had to answer for each other's failures. Whistleblower protections were expanded. Nurses and staff who had once feared retaliation were given a clearer path to speak up. Because in Swango's case, it was often the nurses who saw the truth first, who noticed the patterns, who raised the alarms, and who were ignored. But even after all that reform, cracks remain. Doctors still move between states. Paperwork still gets buried. Administrators still worry about reputation before responsibility. And in under-resourced hospitals, especially abroad, foreign medical hires are still brought in without proper vetting. Desperate institutions, repeating old mistakes. Michael Swango's story is now taught in medical schools, not as a curiosity, but as a case study in systemic failure. A reminder that academic excellence does not equal integrity. That credentials can be faked. That evil can pass every test if no one looks too closely. And so, Swango's legacy is twofold: a warning for medical professionals, and a wound that still hasn't fully healed. There's something uniquely horrifying about the way Michael Swango operated. He didn't kill in anger. He didn't explode with rage. He killed slowly, repeatedly, almost surgically, with a methodical patience that made him nearly invisible. He was the kind of man who could shake your hand while calculating your death. He didn't need a dark alley or a weapon tucked into his coat. He had a syringe, a prescription pad, access, authority. He wore trust like a disguise, and no one questioned it. He slipped between hospital wards like a shadow, blending into scrubs and staff meetings. He filled out charts with perfect penmanship. He made polite small talk while people around him dropped dead. And when their families wept, he offered rehearsed condolences and walked away. It wasn't just the killing that was evil, it was the coldness, the absence of empathy, the ease with which he poisoned a sandwich, injected a line, or doctored a chart. The lack of hesitation. Even now, locked away in ADX Florence, Michael Swango has never expressed regret. He has never publicly admitted how many people he killed. He's never explained why. Maybe he doesn't know himself. Maybe he doesn't care. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying thing of all. Not just what he did, but how little it seemed to cost him to do it. To the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of victims whose names never made it into headlines. To the veterans who survived war only to be killed in a hospital bed. To the elderly who trusted their physician and never woke up again. To the nurses who grew ill after a shared snack in the break room. To the families who were told it was natural causes and lived for years never knowing the truth. To those who sounded the alarm and were told to sit down. This story is for you. It is a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a doctor. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it gets hired again. May this legacy serve not just as a warning, but as a call to action. Because trust must be earned. Because systems must be watched. And because the scariest monsters are often the ones we never suspect.